and that link as well to the video, a link to that video as well. Great. So I guess we'll get started here. My name is Shelly Stusick. I'm the Go Beyond Beauty Specialist for the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. And thank you for joining us for the last webinar in our series for backyard invasives. Today, we're going to talk about herbaceous plants and grasses. And thank you for folks who joined our other webinars. Some of this intro material might be a little familiar for you guys, but just bear with me and we'll get to our species. A little bit of housekeeping. Audrey is available for any IT assistance here. You can message her directly through the chat. And then also, if you guys want to put where you're tuning in from and your name, that would be great in the chat. If you have any questions, you are welcome to put them in the Q&A box down below. And any commentary is welcome, and I'll get to that at the end. All right, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge ISN's major partners and the fact that I particularly am funded by the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program. We also have funding from the Good Neighbor Authority and we are an almost entirely grant funded organization, but we couldn't do the work that we do without our partners. We work in 4 counties here in Leelanau, Manistee, Grand Traverse, and Benzie counties here. And ISN is a cooperative invasive species management area. SISMA, every county in Michigan is covered by one, and those are the counties that we cover. Of course, we'll get to Go Beyond Beauty, the reason why I'm here, my anti-ornamental invasive species outreach program. But ISN also does control of invasive species. We do typically high priority species in high quality habitats. These are things like Japanese knotweed, invasive bittersweet, garlic mustard phragmites. We also do a bit of treatment with early detection species. We do work bees with other organizations or with the public. And those are typically centered around garlic mustard or baby's breath, a more accessible species. And then also we do outreach presentations. The reason I'm here today on the value of habitat and the threat of invasives, of course. And pretty much to anyone who will sit still long enough to listen to us, we'll talk to them about invasive species and habitat. And so it's easy to get into the doom and gloom in the invasive species world. But when we think about why we care about invasives and why we do the work that we do, it's because habitat matters. That's our tagline, our ISN's website as well. habitatmatters.org, but habitat matters for people, recreating, of course, getting into the great outdoors. Habitat matters for wildlife with the tight connections between native wildlife and their native food sources. And habitat certainly matters for Northwest Michigan as our economy is pretty tightly linked to the habitat we have up here, not just our fisheries, our, of course, farmland and wineries, but our forestry efforts as well, and of course, tourism. And so monarch butterflies are a really good poster child for why habitat matters, because, you know, everyone kind of gets the link between monarchs and milkweeds, right? Monarchs can get nectar from many different sources, but if they don't have milkweeds, they cannot continue their life cycle and reproduce. This is a one-to-one kind of connection between monarchs and milkweeds that most people get, but most people don't realize that that is not unique to monarchs. That's a very, very important one-to-one connection that other species have. And these are some local moths and butterfly species, same thing. You might know the northern spicebush swallowtail with its host, the spicebush and sassafras, the Pandora sphinx moth, the double-toothed prominent. These are all local. You know, that one-to-one connection is really important for dozens, if not thousands of other and so when they than other species, say non-native species, and then of course invasive species. So when we have this research by Doug Tallamy here, certain species, native species, do give a little bit more bang for your buck. And so when we look at the Quercus genus oaks, they support over 500 species of just butterflies and moths. That's not including any other wildlife. And, you know, willows, cherries, plums, birch, that sort of thing, those are more widely used species by our native plants. And then we go all the way down to where I added ginkgo trees, Ginkgo biloba, super cute trees, super beautiful. But that's a non-native species and it only hosts 5 species. So when you think about the fact that one brood of chickadees needs 6,000 caterpillars to raise its young, you know, what are you going to plant? You're probably going to plant a native species, hopefully a little more in the oak, willow, cherry, plum, that kind of thing for woody plants, versus a non-native species like ginkgo or a invasive species that hosts very few to none. And so I think people think of conservation as this concept that, you know, land managers are using, you know, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. They think of conservation, oh, that's people who plant trees on Earth Day. That's environmental orgs. And I would like to challenge that notion for folks that, you know, habitat exists everywhere. It just depends on the quality of habitat and how well certain areas are going to be able to support wildlife or pollinators. And so I would like folks to look out their front door and not just see, you know, landscaping, but to see habitat and kind of think in that mindset. So, because conservation is not, you know, the preservation of an already pristine place. If anything, fragmented habitat and spaces, you know, urbanization, things like that, wildlife and pollinators need stopover places. They need resting places, you know, migrating songbirds, they're on their journeys, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about plant management in this webinar, but that's just one aspect of conservation. There's a myriad of things that folks can do in their homes, in addition to managing invasive species and planting native species. But first, we do need to define what's invasive because people throw around this word a lot. The formal definition is a non-native species that harms people, the environment, or the economy. Now, an invasive species can be a plant, it can be an animal. ISN primarily focuses on terrestrial invasive plants. And then, of course, my Go Beyond Beauty program focuses on ornamental plants, invasive plants, the ones that were introduced and not just kind of made their way over. So invasive species is a non-native species. Not all non-native species are invasive. In fact, a lot of non-native species are incredibly important to our economy and other things like that. But these typically look like plants that have few natural predators and typically a massive seed production or growth ability. And we prioritize invasives at ISN not on what is the most invasive species. The most widespread species is not necessarily where our priorities come into play, because of course we have to use our resources, our time, our monies, you know, to get the most bang for our buck in that sense. And so what most invasive species managers like to be in the zone of the early detection and rapid response species. So that would be up on this invasion curve here. We want to get the species that are in between introduction and a little past detection, where we want to get those species early so that we have a better chance of managing them and that they take less resources to manage. Kind of like this garlic mustard picture up here, where we want to pull that one garlic mustard where it's at before it becomes a monoculture. And so part of our outreach and part of our control that we do within our 4 counties that prioritizes species that we have more of a vested interest in getting those populations before they become too widespread. And then, of course, educating folks on the species that are widespread. And how do invasives get here and spread? So invasive species like Phragmites were imported accidentally, through ballast water and ships. A lot of aquatic invasive species were introduced that way. They can be transported through vehicles, through freight, that kind of thing, outdoor gear and tools, wind, water, wildlife, people, pets. A lot of ways that people wouldn't really think that things can spread, they do. And then, of course, we have invasive species that were planted intentionally, either for erosion methods way back in the day, thinking that this will keep things off of roadsides, gardens, of course, with the Go Beyond Beauty program, and then also food and medicine like garlic mustard. So ISN in general, these are our top 12 invasive species. We have baby's breath, barberries, blue lime grass, buckthorns, Callery pear, garlic mustard, invasive honeysuckles, invasive bush honeysuckles. We do have a native honeysuckle, knotweeds, bittersweet, Phragmites, purple loosestrife, and tree of heaven. So those are what ISN have prioritized for our region in our corner of Northwest Michigan. But I do want to point out that all of the species that are circled were intentionally introduced for gardens at one point. And then 6 of those species are still legally sold today. So, what we're managing in natural areas, humans did have a part intentionally in introducing them for ornamental purposes. So this is not unique to Northwest Michigan. Many other areas are seeing the same thing. And compared to other Midwestern states, Michigan does not have as many environmental regulations when it comes to invasive species compared to other Midwestern states. And so this is just an example of that. You can see examples of some woody invasives here that are regulated to a certain extent, whether prohibited or not. They are regulated in other states, but not necessarily Michigan. I like to joke with folks that Michigan will kind of be bringing up the back when we talk about invasive species regulations. People are working on it. So state employees are working on it. This involves compiling research on different species, taking quite a bit of time to research everything that's out there, and then anecdotal information from land managers, and then presenting that to Michigan legislature to see if they will make a decision on regulation for that. But, until that happens, until that process goes through, we do have grassroots programs like Go Beyond Beauty. So Go Beyond Beauty, it is a voluntary, non-regulatory program that celebrates those who commit to not using high priority ornamental invasives. So those going above and beyond the current Michigan regulations, and committing to not use species that are still legal for sale, but the science is there that they're invasive. So I like to refer to this as kind of like a fun club, where we highlight the good and foster the interested. So folks who are already kind of, have this mindset is, they already kind of qualify for the program and are part of our club. So this is for really anyone with a garden. It was originally created with nurseries, garden centers, retailers in mind, but then that also expanded to include landscapers, designers, horticultural professionals, people making those kind of decisions for other folks. And then community participants, anyone with a garden. So whether a law office who wanted to commit to not using invasives in their landscaping could be part of Go Beyond Beauty, or, other organizations, community organizations that sell plants, as part of a plant sale, they can commit to not using high priority ornamental invasives. And I like to joke, it's not even all of the invasives that exist. It's just the really, really bad ones, especially for our area. And this program was inspired by Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, if you guys have read that. And here's an example of our current participating horticultural professionals in our 4 counties. We do have over 70 participants currently in our 4 counties. And so it's an anti-ornamental invasive species awareness program, like an outreach program. And people do get us a little bit confused with native plant programs, which there's some great ones in our area, Plant It Wild. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we do recommend native plants as replacements for invasives, because you can't tell people what not to put in their gardens or what to take out of their gardens without telling them what they should replace it with, or what they should put in their gardens, which is native species. So we work with the horticultural professionals. The biggest, I think, benefit of this program for professionals is a relationship with us, a relationship with ISN works in 4 counties. We like to kind of think of ourselves as a bridging organization. We're working with a lot of partners, and we're able to kind of pass along resources to folks or pass along contact information to folks all throughout our partner list in our counties. So most importantly, folks, the benefit of this program is a relationship and information. But participants do get physical signs and stickers if they want. They get outreach and educational material. You might have seen our Plan Before You Plant brochures, which is actually up on the top image here, where we tell folks, hey, do you like this invasive species? Well, maybe you could replace it with these natives that kind of look the same or kind of fill the same function in your garden. So we recognize all those participants on the previous slide and our community participants for making that commitment. We have our own social media, Go Beyond Beauties on Facebook and Instagram, where we do a little bit more garden focused ornamental information. And then in ISN service area, there are certain things like our Japanese barberry trade-up days, which are events we have every June, where we connect community members to our participating horticultural professionals, whether it be a landscaper or a nursery, that kind of thing. And we have folks bring us Japanese barberry, a woody ornamental invasive, physically bring us that barberry, and we give them a coupon to one of our Go Beyond Beauty participants for a replacement. It's $5 per plant, up to $50. That's our Japanese barberry trade-up days, and an advantage for folks, businesses in the program. And then also locally, we do have achievement levels. We were asked to give trainings to businesses who wanted training for their staff or themselves to identify invasive species, manage invasive species, that kind of thing, explain why certain businesses won't sell these species. And then we do have site visits for non-businesses, our community participants, if folks wanted a site visit to their business or their home, identifying invasives. And recommending native plant replacements. The entire Go Beyond Beauty program is free, but those extras just in our service area, the achievement levels, those are a fee for service just because they're extra for the program that I'm able to do up here. And so I get a lot of people in every presentation, every event that I go to, they say, oh, well, I have one of those, but I don't see it spreading in my yard, so it can't be invasive because I don't see it spreading. It's not an issue for me. And then the irony of this is that the reasons why ornamental invasives are popular are the same reasons that they kind of cause problems. And, the prolific seed production, people really like the look of that. Well, guess what? Wildlife and other things are taking those seeds elsewhere. Birds can take them to someone's back 40 where it's going to be forgotten about for a few years. People like that there's no pests or herbivory, nothing's chewing on these plants. Well, then there's nothing to really keep them in check. So a lot of people do, mulch around their plants and things like that, so they're not able to sucker as much, but that doesn't mean that they aren't spreading in other ways. And then also, this is a good example of Japanese barberry, where ISN takes the stance that to qualify for the Go Beyond Beauty program, and our recommendations to folks is that we do not recommend any invasive species cultivars as well. I know there's been quite a bit of science behind trying to find sterile varieties for certain species. And it's something that we've been burned before, because when you look at pictures like this, a cultivar to select for a red hue to leaves in Japanese barberry, that can, once those seeds go out and get naturalized, they can lose their selected traits and turn back to green. And that's what we see happen a lot with Japanese barberry in particular. All right, now getting into our species, what you're here for, herbaceous plants and grasses. As a reminder, I'm only going to go through a handful of these because I want to get a little more in depth, and I do want to make time for some questions here at the end. So we're going to start with baby's breath. Now, most people are not buying baby's breath plants. I don't know of anyone kind of selling those, but I do know that a lot of wildflower seed packets, even some that claim to be native, will have baby's breath or cultivars within those wildflower seed mixes. And so this is something that is a problem for our area, especially with sleeping bear dunes and our dune ecosystems that are so special to our area. It's found on disturbed sites or dunes, and this has actually a really unique way of spreading where, yes, thousands of seed per plant, but it has this long taproot, and when it's ready, after it's when it's seeded out, it will break off at the base and roll in the wind like a tumbleweed. It's the closest Michigan has to a tumbleweed, and roll all over the dunes and disperse that way, which is kind of unique. The reason we don't want baby's breath on our dunes or in our natural areas is because it causes problems for threatened plants like our native pitcher's thistle and other special dune plants. It stabilizes the dunes, it keeps them in place with their long taproot, and that's not something we want. We want our dunes to shift. It's part of the evolution of plants, like our special plants like pitcher's thistle, and we need the dune ecosystems to shift. And then also its prolific seed production, of course, outcompetes the native species. And so ISN actually does quite a bit of digging of baby's breath in the summer with our partners, GTRLC and others. And here's a picture of that location. So wouldn't you want to join us for a work bee in the summer? And this is what your view would be. And so we really don't want that view of, you can see the huge masses of baby's breath taking over. You can see a little bit of spotted knapweed too. Those are things we don't want in our dune ecosystems. And so baby's breath is a top 12 invasive for ISN service area and a high priority species for Go Beyond Beauty. This is something that's regulated in other parts of the United States and Canada. Like I said, it reproduces through seed. So not that unless you have kind of a waterfront property or anything like that, most people don't have this species, but you can manage it by spot burning with a torch, but it's actually really easy to dig and sever the taproot as far down as possible. And if you do have this, you can burn it. If you get it in an arrangement, like a flower arrangement, dried or fresh, we do ask that you please dispose of it in the garbage and do not try to compost this species. And personally, I don't buy any bouquets with baby's breath just as a matter of principle, but I do know other businesses are kind of adopting this practice as well. In Leelanau, we have a winery. They do lots of events and weddings, and they've told any florist that walks through there and their clients that as a matter of principle, they don't want any baby's breath in arrangements for events on their property, which I think is great. And so please try to avoid those in arrangements, because even if you're not, even if you're disposing of property properly, it's still garnering money and a demand for baby's breath in floral arrangements, which we would really like to see decreased. All right, and then of course, plant those if you can. So native alternatives to baby's breath, a very similar look-alike that's kind of spindly flower. We have a little bit at the Nature Center Gardens in Traverse City here. And that's kind of a one-to-one. If you like the look of it, it's pretty similar. And then we also have, if you like the white look as well, we have common yarrow. This is full apart sun and very dry soil, that kind of thing. That's pretty good replacements for those. Our second herbaceous species is Dame's rocket. I don't know if you guys have heard of Dame's rocket before, but you probably have seen it or walked past it at some point. This is a species native to Europe. It prefers moist soil and full sun, but will tolerate shade, which is kind of a problem for our woodland edges and ecosystems. You'll see that a lot there. This is a relative to garlic mustard, another invasive species, also found in wildflower seed mixes. So you can watch for blooms in June and July. They are typically purple, but sometimes white and pink. This outcompetes native species since it's an aggressive spreader, and then it's also thought to have allelopathic tendencies, which is when plants will secrete a chemical into the soil that disrupts mycorrhizae, the fungus that plants need to absorb nutrients, our native plants. And so this doesn't affect things in its home of Europe, but it does affect things here where it kind of has a competitive advantage, where it kind of makes the surrounding area really, really ripe for their seeds to outcompete native plants as well in that regard. This is a high priority ornamental invasive species for Go Beyond Beauty. It reproduces for seed, just like through seed, just like baby's breath. And one mature plant can have 20,000 seeds, one mature plant of these. And you can kind of see it in this photo. It's just like garlic mustard, where they're kind of spindly sticks that come out. It's not just the heads that give seeds. They kind of have these little candlestick sides that kind of go up. Management, if you do have Dame's rocket, hand pulling is a little bit easier when the soil is moist. It does have kind of a longer root system, so be sure after a rain, that would be the best hand pulling. Foliar treatment for a chemical treatment is effective for this species, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And the surrounding area for many years, because that seed bed is probably rife with those seeds. Disposal, you can burn the seed heads or put them in the garbage, and then dispose of any wildflower seed packets containing those, of course. Some native alternatives to those are a really, really great lookalike is woodland or blue phlox. People often get these confused, actually. So this is a native plant that works well from full sun to part shade, in moist soil, just like Dame's rocket likes. And then when you're out and about and you say, oh, I don't know if that's phlox or I don't know if that's Dame's rocket, because they do look very, very similar. The tool that I use is phlox is 5 letters, so it has 5 petals. And then Dame's rocket, I think Dame has 4 letters and Dame's rocket has 4 petals. So keep that in mind if you're out and about. If you don't know what you have, phlox has 5 petals. A really good native alternative as well is foxglove beard tongue. You guys are probably already familiar with this species. Dry to moist soil, it's a really versatile species. It can be in like dry sand. So if you have Dame's rocket on a kind of drier woodland edge, this would be a great one for that. And then blue-eyed grass, if you have full to part sun, moist, if you have a little bit more wetter soil, blue-eyed grass would be, but still some sun, that would be a really great option as well. Nice purple flower. And for our grasses, we have an example of blue lime grass. And this is something that we've probably, I know I've definitely talked about before in other presentations, and it is a priority species for ISN and Go Beyond Beauty. Native to Europe, again, this is kind of harder to identify because it does look very similar to our native dune grass, but it does have the bluish stem and leaves, and it's hairless with those spikes, just like dune grass, but it is a little bit more robust of a stem as well compared to our native dune grass. And so it often is mislabeled as dune grass, which it's not. And that's why I encourage folks to, when you're at the nursery, when you're buying online, to make sure that there is a Latin name or a scientific name when you're buying species, so that you aren't just going off of cultivar names or whatever ornamental grass. A lot of the time they'll nurseries if they will, and you don't really know what it is. This is one that could definitely be mistaken. So again, this is kind of like baby's breath, where it's an issue because it stabilizes our dune ecosystems. Same issue for threatened plants like pitcher's thistle. For our native dune grass, it can outcompete. And then this is something that takes advantage of water shift levels. You know, when throughout the year as waters recede, it will kind of take over new areas in that regard. This is a restricted species in Wisconsin, not in Michigan, still legal for sale. It reproduces through rhizomes and root fragments, and by seed as well, but mostly through that way. And so for management for this, mechanical removal is not recommended, because a lot of the times when things reproduce by rhizomes, it's really, really sensitive, and even just like a small piece that's left over can generate new shoots. So we do recommend that this can be treated with a foliar herbicide treatment in spring while the native species around it are still dormant. Most invasive species have the competitive advantage of leafing out really early in the season. You'll see it even now since it's spring, and then holding on to their leaves and everything until late. So they effectively have a longer growing season, but that makes it actually really easy in spring to identify invasives, because yes, we do have some native plants greening up right now, but not quite as much as the invasive plants, as you'll see. You'll particularly notice like ground covers and things like that. So disposal, this leave in place if you're treating this. If it comes in a pot, you know, or an arrangement or anything like that, you can dispose of it in the trash. For invasive species, there is a provision under the law that it's not yard waste, but we'll get to this a little bit later, but you do have to contact your trash company. But some of these are just better left in place too. So some native alternatives to blue lime grass, little blue stem, excellent, excellent. If you have sandy soil with full sun, little blue stem is so pretty in the fall, like you can see in that left image there, but such a great species to have established. It's so pretty. It is a little bit of a spready if it's happy, which is good, because when you have those full sun sandy sites, that's really kind of what you want, because not much else will grow in some of those sites. You also have prairie dropseed, which is a very, very attractive native grass as well. It's kind of, it's shorter, smaller, and kind of more toppled over kind of looking as well, versus the upright with little blue stem. That's probably 3 to 4 feet for little blue stem, and then a little bit shorter for the prairie dropseed, as you can see. Those are great grass alternatives. And then for our last species here, we have ribbon grass, also known as reed canary grass. This is something that has a lot of cultivars, and most often you will see the variegated cultivar, meaning the white and green stripes on the leaves for variegated there. But then there's also a pink cultivar where it's variegated with the white and green stripes, but then it also has that pink kind of shining. And there's a cutesy name for it. I totally don't remember. But this is something that's also labeled as an ornamental grass. People don't, some nurseries and things, they don't give out the actual scientific name for this species. So this is a European species that's been planted extensively, and it is thought to potentially, there's a little bit of controversy around its origins, because there was thought to be a native reed canary grass, or at least native to North America, that is, but we are thinking that hybridization and the European species kind of took over. This likes wetter soils, 4 to 5 feet tall, but cultivars are smaller. This is something that if you have a wetland and you have a bunch of grass hanging around, you know, chances are it's pretty widespread. Chances are there is reed canary grass. It's kind of like the weed of the wetland, I would say. This is a high priority ornamental invasive species for Go Beyond Beauty. This is restricted in Wisconsin. It reproduces through rhizomes and root fragments primarily, but also it does seed out, as you can see those seed heads next to that person there. Management, I'm not going to lie to you guys, is a little bit difficult, more difficult for this species than others. There is the possibility or the potential to do repeated mowing and disking, but that's kind of a really long commitment. 5 to 10 years, you're kind of exhausting the seed bank by bringing up new seed to light. And also that's difficult in these areas where it is a little bit wetter for this species typically. This is something that can be treated with a foliar herbicide in late summer and fall. We'll get to treatment a little bit later, but there is a permit required for wetlands and water bodies if you're spraying any sort of herbicide, even over the counter stuff. People also, in combination, will do a prescribed burn in spring and then treat when all the native species are dormant and this is kind of leafing out, and then treating the regrowth with a chemical herbicide a few weeks later with whatever grows up and doing kind of a combination move there. This is something that is recommended where to seed desirable species, kind of our aggressive or our spready native species, you can seed in this area, and that has shown to be definitely helpful for management of these species. And so if you are treating anything chemically, of course, please leave it in place for the options above here. This is not something we recommend trying to dig up as well, unless you have an incredibly small population, which I've never seen a small population of reed canary grass, unfortunately. So some alternatives to ribbon or grass or reed canary grass is switchgrass. This is a fold apart sun, dry to moist soil, so kind of similar looking seed heads as well there, and same kind of environment, dry to moist, that kind of thing. It can get those kind of edges of moist soil too. So invasives love a good transition zone or a good edge. And so planting native species right along there can be kind of helpful. There's also, that's a good one-to-one kind of replacement. Looks very similar, same environment, but I included a couple other options in here. Side oats, grama, that's a really, really short native grass. It has really cool side oats, refer to its fruit there where it's on one side and they kind of hang down. That's for a shorter option depending on what you're trying to do with your property. And then big blue stem, which is on the other end, which is very, very tall, also called turkey's foot because it has kind of 3 seed heads at the top. That's fold apart sun, moist soil. And this is a really, really, I would like to say like majestic species. I love the blue stems, big and little blue stem, because they look so great in the fall. They just have terrific color. All right. So invasive species management. I will say this forever. The #1 method is to prevent invasions from even occurring. Plant landscape alternatives. I like to tell folks, if something's kind of on the outskirts invasive, why don't you just do your future self a favor and choose something else so that you don't have a problem on your hands if you want to, habitat aside and native planting aside, it's some of these invasives are a real problem to get rid of. They're time consuming. And so I tell folks, just don't even chance it and just go with a different species. That's gonna be a lot easier if you want to change up your space. But with any invasive species management, ISN will tell you, your individual infestation or your individual property, it totally depends. There's not a one fits all. And that's why we kind of give options. And so, yeah, you're welcome to contact ISN if we're your local SISMA, and we'll get to that in a second here. But you really do have to consider your resources, your time, physical ability, any monetary resources that you want to kind of put into this and align that with your goals for your property. But this is why prevention and early is really important. Knowing kind of what's on your property, it's a lot easier to get rid of one small patch of something versus, you know, you ignore it for 5 years and now it's pretty widespread. And so I encourage folks to prioritize not only our higher priority species for your area. You know, there are lots of invasive species out there, but our Go Beyond Beauty priority species are the things that I would choose first to tackle. And then also to tell folks, satellite populations are your first priority. And then second priority would be edges, you know, if you have a woodland edge. And then you can go after kind of like your big monocultures, but I wouldn't start in the middle of a big monoculture. I would start at the edges, and then I would be looking in the surrounding area to see if it's spread and try to get those satellite populations first. Excuse me, I do recommend, or I do want to say with chemical treatments, and that's only if you're comfortable, you know, we give them out as an option. We can't say what's the best thing for your property because it's your space and your priorities. But we do give those as an option for some species. Sometimes it is the right tool for the job. And I do want to point out that timing is a really big consideration with chemical treatments. And so please contact your local SISMA to ask, you know, what time should I be doing this? Folks can walk you through what's the best option, because something that you can buy, you know, at a Farm and Fleet or Home Depot or whatever isn't necessarily the right chemical for every single invasive and that kind of thing. And then please, please, please read all label instructions and wear personal protective equipment. Cover your eyes, your head, gloves, that sort of thing. But no matter your method, invasive species management is not a one and done, even for chemical treatments. Some people think that they can just do it once and that's it. Because not only if you have seed species, you have a seed bank in that local area that's probably really, really high percentage of those invasive species seeds in the seed bank, and then also resprouting. If you don't get all the fragments of roots of some plants, especially grasses, then you're going to have that resprout, and you can pretty much plan on it. And that's why, you know, doing treatment, you don't just like leave the site alone. And speaking of that, and like I said earlier, invasive species love a bare area. They love a disturbed site. They love an edge. They love an opportunity. And so, you know, don't give them that opportunity to reinvade or another species to come in. You know, we encourage folks to reseed an area or plant a native plant in place and plant natives. All right, disposal. So, you know, invasive species do not qualify as yard clippings. I know, but I want to say that your local trash person coming up and picking up your stuff, if they see a huge shrub or something hanging out of your garbage can, they're not going to know it's an invasive species. And there's also, depending on your company, special provisions. Some people like to bag, some people want you to drop it off directly. And so contact your local trash provider or local landfill about disposing of invasive species in the trash. But I do want to say that does not apply to restricted invasive species. So species that are a little bit regulated, like Phragmites, purple loosestrife, Japanese or Bohemian knotweeds. So if you have any of like special species, we didn't talk about those today. Those weren't in our examples. But state restricted species, please know what the law is for those, because you're not allowed to move them off site and you're not allowed to dispose of them in the trash. And yes, for timing, for fruiting, we do encourage folks that if your plant already has seed heads on it and you want to get rid of it, we actually recommend that you leave it in place for next year and try to get it before it's fruiting. And before those seed heads are on there, because you don't want to be you don't want to be causing new infestations. And sometimes some of those seed heads, especially like for Dame's Rocket, can pop and spread the seed like that if it's touched. So not all invasive species are disposed of the same. the Michigan DNR does have a Michigan Citizens Guide to Invasive Plant Disposal that I kind of took a little excerpt up here, where it can tell you if it's safe to compost, bag, or burn. But there are different options. I do want to say, I know especially up here, you do have to have a permit for burning in some areas. Some areas you don't. So look up your local ordinances. And then some general tips for avoiding ornamental invasive species. Of course, if you buy native species, they can't possibly be invasive. You can check with ISN or your local SISMA or online. I'll give a piece of information on the next slide that we'll look up. Look for scientific names, like I said, and then watch out for cultivars as well, because some plants are invasive species cultivars, but they don't necessarily look the same. And then if very little time, ask an associate or a quick Google. And so I have this graphic here from Go Beyond Beauty's social media where it says, how do I know what's invasive? And you can go to the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, or MISIN. I like to tell folks they have a species information pages, like a list. And if you are thinking of planting something and it's not on that list, I tell most folks you're usually good to go. How do I know historically what is native? The Michigan Flora, or My Flora, through the University of Michigan Herbarium. That's a great site. You can tell if species are native or not through that website. And then if you're still not sure, feel free to ask. Here's some other invasive plants and grasses. I can't obviously get to everything, but I did put some species that I thought people might be for herbaceous plants and grasses that I think people might be surprised with. So Chinese silvergrass, Miscanthus sinensis. There is a Japanese silvergrass as well. These, are in a lot of ornamental landscapes. If you have kind of a privacy screen that's a grass, that's probably one of these species. There's annual honesty, or money plant, it's also called, where we have those kind of silver discs, and they do look very, very cool. That is a weedier invasive as well, can be found in the same places as Dame's rocket. Orange daylilies, people are kind of surprised. This is, all of these are kind of, or these ones that these three on the left here are lower tier ornamental invasive species. So they're not super, super priority, but I just kind of throw them out there for fun, for a jump scare. And then we do have two early detection species that I would like to point out, coltsfoot and butterbur. So these are kind of wetter, bigger leaves. The coltsfoot is a lot smaller than butterbur, and butterbur can actually get really, really tall. And those are our early detection species. So if you see anything like that, if you see it for sale, please stick away from those species, because even though they're not on our priority lists, they still are of concern for our area. And so some resources, I talked about MISIN, and Audrey, I think, dropped it in the chat. And I will follow up on the follow-up email. I'll list all these too, so you don't have to rush to write them down. But the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, or MISIN, great resource for invasives. And then I'd like to point out that every county in Michigan is covered by a SISMA. ISN is the SISMA for Benzie, Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Manistee counties up here. But if I know there are folks tuning in from elsewhere, and so you have a local invasive species org that can tell you what's the priority for your area. And yeah, you can look them up at michigan.gov. We're still happy to answer questions, but we do want to connect folks with their local folks. And then for ISN locally, we have our Go Beyond Beauty program. I talked about our Japanese barberry trade-up days. Invasive species dumpsters, we provide garlic mustard and ornamental ground cover places for you guys to dispose of those, and we'll advertise that. We do have work bees and workshops, HWA survey trainings, garlic mustard and baby's breath removal, autumn olive workshops, invasive ID hikes. And then we do have a tool library to be used locally if you want some invasive shovels, really sharp shovels for digging. We have weed wrenches that kind of can help you get rid of some woody invasives by using leverage for mechanical removal instead of digging. And that's it for me. I think I'm doing pretty good on time here. Thank you guys for joining us. And I've been kind of keeping an eye on the chat here.
We got 3 questions to answer.
Okay, great. I can't see the Q&A. Wait.
Okay, well, I'll read them to you. Recently, I noticed baby's breath for sale at a local grocery store and floral shop. Does ISN and or Go Beyond Beauty contact those types of sellers to encourage them not to sell this plant?
Yes, I can answer that. So I don't know if you are local, but we did reach out to, if we get requests from members of the community and just, when we have time to do it, for to investigate. There's bittersweet vine and holiday wreaths and stuff like that. And so I will inquire with folks about that. We've had a very positive response. I want to shout out to Oriana in Traverse City here. Both locations, they have been phenomenal to work with, where I, inquired about the baby's breath they were selling in displays. And then also some local farm had some bittersweet vine in their holiday wreaths, and they had a really, really great response to that. And I haven't seen anything since. And then they also printed it up and put it in their newsletter of like my public question and then their public response for accountability, which I thought was awesome. And so I've had some really great conversations with local farmers too, who didn't know it was invasive, just thought it was on their property, so they'd include them because they were pretty, and so ISN will reach out on behalf of concerned community members. And so that's what happened in Oriana's case. And it was a really, really successful. I know I've also reached out to some shops that were selling wildflower seed mixes with baby's breath in them and have had a positive response. We're not, we just try to give the information to people. We're not the state, we're not regulatory. We're just like, hey, can we have a conversation? And some people are like, yes, and open to that. And some people are like, no, and don't respond. And that's totally fine. I can actually see now. Fruiting shrubs can be a good time to identify invasives. They can be marked with flagging tape for removal at a later time when they're not fruiting. Yes, that's great. Marking is super nice. When I do site visits, some people have little flagging tape. That's great because they look different in all types of seasons. And Carol says, what is the best app for our phones? I use Seek iNaturalist, and it's not very good with grasses. Grasses are hard. I will give you that. No app is infallible, and even no human is infallible. We like to get natural resources, people who know can ID grasses. All of the grasses are wizards because it's so complicated and there's so many grasses. I personally use Picture This. It is, I think they give you like 3 or 5 IDs free and then you have to pay. So that's one that I use that is pretty successful, but I also use Seek because you don't need service to use Seek. So when I was in the field, it could get me kind of to even the genus and I could make a connection or a guess for which species as well. So that's the one I use, but there's actually, I'll include it in the follow-up email, but I think MSU Extension did a really great plant ID app kind of experiment, and I will include that article in the follow-up email to you guys. And it looks like Audrey answered the rest
And there's nothing
of the questions. Is there anything fun in the chat? I love everyone's comments.
It's mostly my links.
Mostly Audrey's links. That's okay. But we did have someone say, Carol said, I did the recent invasive species hike at the Commons. It was wonderful. And then are the videos for the last webinar also available? Yeah, so you should, if you registered for the trees and shrubs and the ground covers, you should have gotten an email, but they are both actually uploaded to our YouTube page, which I'm sure is already posted here. Yep. So you can find those, and that's where we will upload this webinar recording as well. So, and I will send out in the follow-up email a survey for you guys. If you could give us some feedback, ISN takes feedback really seriously. So if you want to give us some feedback or just comments, that would be greatly appreciated. But I think that's all we have for today. And thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.